Captain Midnight.
This video is sponsored by Audible. So, okay, I would understand if you disagreed with the title of this video. I could be here all day listing Spider-Man villains that haven't had a chance to be in a movie yet. So why go back to one that was in his very first? And I think that's pretty fair. I would love to see characters like Kraven, the Chameleon, and Morlun on the big screen. And Big Wheel, obviously. But the more I thought about it, the more excited I was by the idea of the Green Goblin in the MCU, and the ways that he could be used to push this Peter Parker into some pretty interesting places. So in this video, I'm going to try to make my case that even though we've seen him before, Norman Osborn could be the perfect person to face off against Spider-Man after Far From Home.
He arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighbor.
I think there's a reason that the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus are generally considered Spider-Man's most iconic bad guys, because comic book villains tend to work best when they reflect back on the hero's personality in a meaningful way, and the Green Goblin has always done that. In many ways, he's kind of the mirror image of who Spider-Man could be without the sense of responsibility he gained after Uncle Ben's death. Like Peter, he's got a great scientific mind, and Norman often recognizes their similarities. I especially like in Ultimate Spider-Man how he basically just says that Peter is the son he wishes Harry was. But of course, how they apply their talents is totally different. Norman has more money and power than Peter could ever dream of, but like I mentioned, he lacks that responsibility, being steered purely by self-interest and obsession with his own genius. And that's what makes him a great foil for Peter Parker. But still, I have to admit that we saw this dynamic already in the first Raimi movie, so why try it again? Well, I think that's where the MCU comes in, because I think that Norman Osborn, with or without taking up the mantle of the Green Goblin, could be this Spider-Man's most interesting villain yet. So much of the criticism surrounding Tom Holland's Spidey has been about Tony Stark, and the long shadow that he casts over both Homecoming and Far From Home. I think a lot of that criticism tends to get overblown, honestly, but one thing I do agree with is that this version of Peter Parker kind of has an easier life than most versions of the character have. He gets picked up by private jets, he has fancy suits made for him, and him and May seem to be very financially stable after meeting Tony in Civil War. I don't think any of this ruins the movies or anything like that. And there was that whole thing where he, died. But I do think some of those criticisms are valid, and that the ending of Far From Home could really change all of that. I think it would be interesting to start out with a Peter Parker on the run, no jets, drones, or Avengers to turn to. And to introduce a new Norman Osborn into that situation could be really smart. Because in the MCU, Norman would come across as kind of a dark reflection of Tony Stark. We've had the well-meaning billionaire, but now Peter would experience the exact opposite. Someone who has all, or at least most, of the resources of Stark. But instead of any of that being at Peter's disposal, he'll have lost almost everything and has to face it down with just his powers and his wits.
What could be more perfect? Me on the cover, not the Hulk. Pizzazz, the almost perfect new monthly.
If there's anything I want from the next Spider-Man movie, it's for it to be a lot more scrappy. Now that probably sounds vague, but I hope you kind of know what I mean. I love just that general sense that Peter is working with what he has and is kind of just making it up as he goes along. Even if his suit is torn up, his body is broken, and his relationships are in shambles. This doesn't mean I think the movie should be an ultra-dark slog or anything. Like, the humor in the Tom Holland movies has been a lot of fun, and I hope they keep it around. But I do think embracing some higher emotional stakes would feel right, especially for the third movie. Tom Holland's Peter Parker is a very trusting person, and that was something that Mysterio was able to take advantage of in Far From Home. And while I don't think they should go back to that well again in the same way, I do think it would be interesting to give us a Spider-Man movie with a more paranoid feeling to it, where Peter doesn't really know who to trust, as people who used to have his back are now nowhere to be found or actively betray him once New York has turned on him. Norman could be the person behind the scenes orchestrating all of that, maybe even funding the Daily Bugle and using Jameson as a puppet. Spider-Man has fought two guys who felt bitter jealousy towards Tony Stark, but now he could face someone on Stark's actual level, with no Avengers or even adults in his corner, totally alone. I think that would really help re-establish Peter as the everyman underdog, the ultimate street-level hero that I think he is. But I've talked a lot about Peter Parker, so what about Norman Osborn himself? Well, I think they should really change him up this time around. We've seen Norman in so many Spider-Man stories on both the big and small screen that I think a fresh take is pretty necessary. The first Spider-Man movie really leaned into the idea of Oscorp as a military contractor, so that's pretty well-trodden territory in Spidey movies and the MCU in general, so I'd probably avoid that altogether. And I would maybe go younger for Norman, someone like Oscar Isaac, an actor totally wasted in X-Men Apocalypse, but who I think could be really perfect here. Isaac specifically is so good at playing both an earnest, nice guy, or someone who's really darkly intense and ego-driven. Instead of going the weapons route, Oscorp here could be more of a commentary on Silicon Valley tech companies in general. I'll be honest, I've been reading a lot of articles recently about the guy who started WeWork, and I think it's easy to see how someone like that could fit in really nicely as a modern Spider-Man villain. Peter Parker loves science and technology. He goes to a STEM school, and his biggest idol was a genius scientist and CEO. Tossing him into a storyline that exposes him to the dark side of tech could be a pretty great character arc. In Norman, he could meet someone who embodies everything he thinks he respects, only to find that being a smart, quippy genius doesn't mean much without Spider-Man's sense of responsibility to back it up.
Spider-Man has arrived at Blockbuster, and we've got the best way to bring the movie home. Buy it on DVD.
It's often said that the best villains are the ones who don't see themselves as evil at all. They're morally justified in their own heads. So far, this Spider-Man has faced down two villains going after pretty base, understandable goals. They want money or fame, and they want revenge. And I've enjoyed that, but I think all that stuff is too small for someone like Norman. I'd like to see a villain that thinks he could build his own tech utopia, no matter how many people, or even his own employees, he has to step on to get there. Someone with an ego so big that any opinions outside of his own aren't even worth considering, and he's baffled that anyone could disagree with him. Think a more charismatic version of the tech genius that Oscar Isaac played in Ex Machina. Someone who could excite a room with their vision of the future, but has no problem being a heartless cutthroat either. Ultimate Silicon Valley CEO. Now, Harry I'm not so sure about. This version of Norman not having any kids does make a lot of sense to me, but if you have any ideas for a new take on Harry Osborn, I'd love to read them in the comments. I also think this could add a really fun angle to the Goblin's costume. I really sympathize with the designers on that first Raimi movie. The Power Rangers look wasn't perfect, but it made sense in the context of the story. And I understand that a lot of people would probably want a comics accurate version here, but in my imagined take on this character, I'd love to see a costume inspired by the sleek designs of things like Apple and Google products. Now, that's obviously much easier said than done. How do you take one of the most over-the-top costumes in comics and turn it into something that looks really modern and techy? Honestly, I don't know. But if they could pull it off, I think that would work pretty perfectly.
Web-spinning Spider-Man.
This is Web Spinning Spider-Man with Flyaway Action Pack.
But what all of this really comes down to is that I think Norman Osborn is a character essential to the story of Spider-Man. And as the MCU Spidey goes on, I'd really like to see him make a return in some form. At his core, I think Norman Osborn is a cautionary tale for Peter Parker, and that's something I think he needs in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. One thing is for sure though, the next Spider-Man movie is still quite a ways off. But if you're in the mood for a Spidey story right now, I've got good news for you. I just listened to Spider-Man: The Darkest Hours, a novel by Dresden Files writer Jim Butcher that weaves together Rhino, Black Cat, and a more adult take on Peter Parker into probably the best Spider-Man novel I've come across. And if you want to check it out, you're in luck, because right now, for a limited time, you can get Audible for 3 months for only $6.95 a month, which is more than half off the usual price. This is an amazing deal because every month you get a free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. So whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, nonfiction, biographies, whatever, Audible is gonna have you covered at a pretty unbeatable price. So go to audible.com/midnight or text midnight to 500-500. That's audible.com/midnight or text midnight to 500-500.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts.